Okay, so after many years of listening to me tout the value and the benefit of ground poles or cavaletti, I might use those terms interchangeably through this short webinar, just FYI. Many of you are embracing ground poles for your own horses and feeling motivated and inspired to jump out there and use ground poles for the purpose of conditioning our horses. So I'm going to cover in this quick webinar how to and why to go about this process for your horse. So let's boogie right along here. The first, now this might seem obvious, but the first place to start is to ask yourself, why are you intending to use ground poles? So here's the thing. You may have like read a magazine article, if people still get print magazines, I don't know, or maybe you saw something online. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of cool social media accounts that have really fancy and elaborate patterns that you can set up with ground poles, and they look pretty exotic and fun. And you might get enticed to try that out. Your trainer might have told you to do some ground pole. Maybe I told you to do some ground poles. But every horse stands to gain something unique to their individual physiology, their age, what your riding goals are. So the thing is, there's different ways to use ground poles, and you really want to do what's appropriate and the best for your horse. So stop and ask yourself, why you might be considering doing ground poles. There's typically three prime main reasons that people will incorporate poles into their schooling. Number one, maybe you're using them in a rehab setting. So maybe your horse has had some sort of a layup or episode that required some veterinary intervention, maybe a lot of time off. Maybe there were some coordination deficits that were identified or proprioceptive deficits. Um, or you are simply bringing that horse back into fitness after a prolonged layup. This would be a rehab setting. Maybe that is not your scenario. Maybe you've watched some YouTube videos, you're kind of bored with your current routine, and you're just trying to, mix things up a little bit, give your horse a little bit of novel stimulus. Lastly, and this is probably the biggest group that I encounter, is people looking to improve their horse's fitness in some way. Generally, we're talking about their improving strength when we talk about using ground poles. The reason it matters that you identify why you're using poles is it's going to dictate what kinds of patterns you set up and how many times you would perform the pattern and what gaits you would be using. So in a rehab setting, to be honest, mostly you're just walking. There are incredibly valuable rehab walk exercises using poles. There's a lot of them in my 55 corrective exercises book that a lot of you own. That's just one resource, but there's a ton out there for you. But mostly because we are trying to target the deep postural muscles, you're mainly just going to have a bunch of walking routines. Now, if you're looking to mix things up and just have fun with your horse, there's no clear prescription. You're going to use maybe all the different gaits. Maybe each week you're going to do a different gait and a different pattern, just as a point of having something different to do. However, in that example, if you're just using ground poles for something fun, you should limit the number of repetitions you do of a routine, because we're going to assume if it's novel for the horse to do, that we're going to assume they haven't been doing it, which means they are predisposed to soreness. Cavaletti work does require more from the musculoskeletal system. So you do want to be judicious with the number of reps. Now, if you're using poles in a cross training or conditioning method, mainly you're going to use trot and canter gaits. You're going to have probably just one, maybe two, if your horse has a high level of fitness, weekly sessions where you focus on these exercises in trot and or canter. And you're going to try to progressively increase the difficulty or challenge of those routines over the course of the next 2 months. And we'll talk about that more in a second, but for the purposes of increasing fitness. So identifying why you're doing ground poles really lets you fine tune the patterns that you're going to use. So, number one, regardless of what reason you choose, is you're not going to see any results from ground poles if you're not consistent. And I know this is not the most exciting or thrilling tip that I could give you. I mean, just the word consistency itself is a little bit boring, right? But the reality is, as with many things related to fitness, showing up and putting in the time and the work is like 90% of the journey. So if you decide, yes, I want to do ground poles, you do not need to have complicated, elaborate patterns. You do need to be consistent. That does not mean every day, depending on the goal that you've identified. Rehab, just introducing fun, or improving your horse's strength and fitness. That's going to dictate how many times per week you do the patterns, but the goal is to be consistent with that once a week, twice a week, 3 or 4 times a week in the case of rehab setting. Just doing ground poles, and this is what I commonly see, once every, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks, it can be fun for the horse, but you're not going to see the gains from a fitness standpoint that you would want to see. So there's the boring reality. Now, as I said, it does not need to be complicated. So the exercise I have on the screen here for you is a basic box. This is honestly, it's one that I set up the most frequently because it's so easy. You only need 4 poles. Look, I know that dragging poles out into the arena sometimes is a real bummer. So keep it simple. Otherwise, you're probably not going to be consistent with your ground poles. But setting up a box, you only need 4 poles. It doesn't matter exactly what size your poles are. Just make a box with whatever length of poles you have. I have some variations on the right side here of this diagram of different ways to use a box, but honestly, just making a big clover leaf pattern that passes through the box is one of my favorite routines. You're incorporating bending and stepping and flexing over the poles. If you have risers, you can raise the corners, but you certainly do not. This is a pattern that can be used in a rehab um, setting and also for improving strength and fitness. And you could also use it for just introducing, some novelty and fun to your horse too. So it's a versatile one. Now, when in doubt, you can always just walk. So sometimes people ask, how many reps should I do? Should I, post the trot or sit the trot? Or, they just start having all these questions. When in doubt, just walk. There's so much value in walk. In fact, if you're interested to hear a little bit more about this, I recorded a podcast episode on my podcast with a gaited horse trainer by the name of Carl Bledsoe. Some of you might be familiar. It's episode 5 in season 5. If you're looking for that on the podcast, Best Horse Practices with Jack Ballou podcast. And he goes over how he uses ground poles almost exclusively in the walk for instating good movement patterns in horses that are so compromised in their movements that they almost appear neurologic. So, just to highlight the value of walk-based exercises. Now, following up on consistency, the second golden rule here, after you've identified why you're using poles and kind of what gaits you would be using on the poles and what kinds of patterns are going to be appropriate for you, posture trumps everything. So here in this photo is me working with an Arabian mare, and this posture is not great. So we see the horse is fairly hollow, a little bit high-headed. The back is dropped. She's leaning towards me with her body weight. You can see I'm the handler on the ground there. She's kind of leaning inwards, also evidenced by the fact that she's not crossing over the middle of the pole. She has drifted almost over the riser block here on my end. So I use this example to show this is a horse not in great posture. My general rule is if a horse is new to ground poles, generally they're not going to have an ideal posture the first 1 or 2 times crossing over the poles. And I always like to say, give it a few reps, like up to 5 reps of crossing over the poles. Often, if a horse is going to sort of start to organize their body and get in a better balance, they will by that time. So give them that time to see if they to see if this mare would come into a better posture. If so, then carry on for just a few more reps. You want to find that sweet spot of balance and then carry on for a few more reps, not forever and ever and ever. But if she does not improve the posture after I offer her a couple more experiences with the poles in this particular session, I would stop. And the first thing I would do is lower the poles off those risers and put them on the ground, because you want the horse in a good posture before you raise the poles, before you start working at speed. So, number one, don't automatically assume you're getting great value out of your ground poles if the horse is in a not so great posture, because you're always making something stronger. Unfortunately, a lot of times we could be making the wrong muscles, the wrong posture stronger. I kind of just touched on this, but a lot of folks will ask me, should I raise the poles up? Again, maybe almost all of us, when we post photos online, I have a lot of them that show the poles on risers, but that's because my horses do ground poles a lot, and I need to raise them up to get a little bit more effort, and a little bit more out of my horses. But to be honest, when I go teach clinics, most of the time I have the poles on the ground for the reasons that I just stated, because I want to make sure the horse demonstrate a very, very smooth rhythm and good balanced posture going over the pole routines before I ever raise them up. So sometimes it might take a couple of weeks for you repeating these exercises on a weekly basis to start to have the horse in a good posture. Don't assume that, more is better, bigger is better. There is a lot of value in poles on the ground. So start there. And then if you decide to raise them up, these risers illustrated here, I do sell in my online store, jackbaloo.com. They're fabulous. They're like indestructible. They store really easily. They're easy to move around. And these are my favorite. If you are looking for more structured guidance, I do have a 30-day online course. It never expires once you enroll in it, and you can find it at the URL on the screen. It takes you through walk, trot, and canter routines. They progress over the course of the month in terms of, difficulty and challenge. You certainly don't have to do all the gaits. You can pick and choose based on where your horse is, but there's clear explanations, easy diagrams you can print out and take to the barn with you. So check that out if you are interested in pursuing a bit more conditioning with your horse and ground poles. So in the meantime, I want to say thank you all, and we'll catch you